Hello everyone, and welcome to this PwC webinar on a very exciting topic. At least we are very excited about it in our recording studio here. We're going to discuss how to strengthen sustainability reporting with due diligence processes. My name is Susanne Stormer. I'm a partner and the ESG and Sustainability Services leader in PwC here in Denmark. And it is my privilege to lead the discussion today. And today, when we are hosting this webinar live, is a very, very special day, because it is the day when it is anticipated that the European Parliament will approve of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, also known as CSDDD. We are looking at a history that goes more than a decade back. And I want to, first of all, pay tribute to those people who paved the way for this to happen. So as we are looking to the European Parliament and its final vote today, and the subsequent process of a publication in the official journal in May, then a 2-year period to transpose the directive into national law, and a phase-in period of 3 to 5 years for companies to meet the requirements. This is, as you will see, a very lengty, but also a very thorough process to ensure that we get this directive adopted, that many of us have been waiting for, and some of us have been working for quite hard. And I want to, on this occasion, actually make a very special call out to one of the participants in this webinar, Sanne Boes from Amnesty Denmark, who has been tirelessly advocating for making human rights due diligence into law in Denmark as well as in Europe. What we're talking about is this publication, The Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, developed as a result of a very, very long consultative process led by Professor John Ruggie, who was a special representative to the UN Secretary General. And this was implemented more than a decade ago. And so here we are today. So it's a very special day. And even if this webinar is hosted on an early morning, I would say let's have a bubble toast, certainly when hopefully the expected vote goes through. So what makes this special is that it is combined with reporting on what you do. And in this webinar, we will be discussing what we are seeing to be implemented with this directive. And at the end of that process of due diligence is human rights reporting. And what you will find as you practice this is that good human rights reporting, in the words of Caroline Rees, who is the president of SHIFT, the legacy organization after John Ruggie, good human rights reporting can spark meaningful conversation. So in the reporting process, as you prepare for what you will disclose from your business, then you get prompted to discuss and challenge your own assumptions, your approaches, and importantly also to identify areas for improvement. And in parallel with this, you will be having conversations with your stakeholders, with your external stakeholders, with your employee groups, and translate those insights into an understanding of what are our human rights risks as a company, as a business, how do we address them, and how do we deal with the challenges that are not so easy to just fix. And we will be talking about that as we go through this webinar. Why does CSDDD matter? Well, it matters to citizens of the world because now there will be better protection of their human rights and, mind you, also including labor rights. We will see a healthier environment for present and future generations. So the due diligence directive also covers diligence regarding environmental impacts. We will see products and services that will be made in a more sustainable way. Some would say in a less unsustainable way. We are moving in a direction towards more sustainable products and services. They will be able to have more trust in what businesses do and what they say. There will be more transparency on informed choices. And importantly, also, there will be better access to justice for victims. For the companies, and many of you will be representing companies, you will now have a harmonized legal framework across the EU, which creates much more legal certainty and a level playing field. You will enjoy higher trust from your customers and more commitment from your employees. There will be internally with your management a much greater awareness of those adverse impacts that you need to tackle. You will have a much more robust and better risk management, which considers not only the financial risks to your business that could undermine your future success, but also the reputational risks that could really have a major impact suddenly or over time. And you will have better access to finance because you can demonstrate that you comply with the legislation. And then many are saying that this directive is about developing countries. It is indeed about developing countries and the rest of the world. But for developing countries, there will be better protection. And this is where, again, coming back to the UN guiding principles, which really made it clear that there is an obligation, a duty by states to protect their citizens, whereas companies must respect the human rights of people. So with this, we have better protection. We would have more awareness. We would also see more sustainable investment flowing into developing countries, and we will have eventually improved living conditions for people, which is what this is all about in the first place. For those of you who have been following the European regulation, you will have seen that there's a host of initiatives coming out of the European Green Deal package. And thankfully, there is a link and there is a connection between the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation for financial institutions, the taxonomy regulation for both financial institutions and for what is called non-financial companies, the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that requires that companies describe their due diligence processes, the standards that complement the directive, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, where you need to include a statement and a description of your due diligence processes. And this all now comes together in the CSDDD, which is why this final piece of legislation has been anticipated so much by all the stakeholders involved in this process. And what you must do according to the CSDDD, and we will deep dive into the elements of it, is to describe what is the behavior that you have across your company. What are the processes that you are implementing to identify and address the negative impacts on people and the environment? So now it's my privilege to introduce the agenda and also to introduce my guests in this studio. So we have my colleague, Mette Sørensen, who will be going through the changes in the proposed text and also the drama that has been in the process leading up to today. So stay tuned for that, because those of you who have been following it may not have caught all of the details, of which there are quite a few principal ones as well. And then we have Dorte Viksø from Lundbeck, who is the head of corporate sustainability there, and therefore you own the due diligence process in the organization, and you have been working as a practical, or taking a practical approach to how do we deal with the challenges and how do we set up a robust procedure for our due diligence. And you have done so starting from what do we need to get in order, and then building it along the way. And then we will get back to the reporting requirements, which Mette will take us through again. And then we have a Q&A session where you can ask questions as we go along. And what we also want to emphasize is, as always, for those many of you who have been participating in our webinars previously, is you can raise your questions in the chat all along. We will also have a pause after Dorte's presentation, because we anticipate that there would be lots of questions for Dorte, like how do you do this in practice? And important to say as a disclaimer, we are not going to give you all the magic bullets, because likely they don't exist. But what we will give you is some practical guidance on how you can approach it in your business, in your context. So with that, and with no further ado, let's go to the changes in the text. And over to you, Mette.
Thank you, Susanne. Yes, it's indeed been a very dramatic journey for the file, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. It was proposed by the Commission in February 2022 and was negotiated for almost 2 years. And there was actually an agreement in December between the Council and the Parliament on a text. But over the next months, as at least some member states were kind of pulling back from the compromise text, and a new one was proposed in March. And that is the text that the Parliament today is going to vote about. And we, of course, anticipate, we have heard a lot of positive words from the Parliament that they will vote in favor of the file, so that we will have an adoption very, very soon. So what can we expect from this file? We have been looking through everything that's made public available, and I should just add the disclaimer in the beginning that, of course, we need to see the final text to really be certain that all these details are in place. But this is what we have taken out from what has been made public and what has been discussed in the media. So the timeline, first of all, if there is an adoption today, we expect it to be published maybe already in May in the official journey. And that means that the clock will start ticking. Then there will be a 3-year phase-in for the first companies that need to implement the due diligence processes, and then reporting about it 1 year later. And the first group of companies are those with more than 5,000 employees. This is for EU companies, I should say, and with an net revenue from more than 1.5 billion euros. The next group is then with more than 3,000 employees and net turnover of, of 900 million euros. And the last group is for more than 1,000 employees and a net turnover with more than 450 million. And for the non-EU companies, they will not follow the employee threshold, but they will follow the net turnover threshold. And then what is in the file? What is the requirements, the obligation? Well, the main part of the due diligence directive is still, thankfully, the requirement to actually implement processes for due diligence on sustainability within the company. And we will get back to how that differs from the requirements in the reporting directive. But you will see here from the illustration that it is more or less the same elements, the same structure that you might recognize from the disclosure requirements and principles of the CSRD. So first of all, a company needs to embed due diligence in the organization, in strategy and in management. And the next phase is then something that a lot of you will recognize from the double materiality assessment, to be able to identify and assess your negative impacts or adverse impacts, as they are called in the due diligence directive. This is really the core, a risk-based approach to due diligence, to be able to identify in order to then, as the third step, to address the negative impacts that you have identified. And that means that you both have to seize it if you are able to, or prevent or minimize it to the extent that it's possible. You also have to track your progress. So that would translate in reporting terms into setting targets and to follow how your progression is towards those targets, and be able to then evaluate if your efforts are efficient and if you're doing enough to address the issues you have identified. And then you have a step communication, which of course translates into reporting. And those companies that are both in scope for the due diligence directive and the CSRD reporting directive, they can report about the due diligence process in CSRD. And finally, there's a step that should not be missed, which is remediation, the obligation to offer some compensation or to make remediating measures towards those that might have suffered from the negative impacts of your company, or in other terms, make the wrong right again. And all of this is, of course, mirroring the OECD due diligence guidelines, and there's a lot of good recommendations and guidance that can be found in that universe. Also, I should say that it is both human rights and the environment that is covered by the obligation. Next, I've tried to do a list a little bit about what we know that has changed from the original text of the directive to the file that they are voting about today. So first of all, the due diligence obligation is still there. It's still the core, and it still has a mandatory status. The next thing is the chain of activities definition. We started out with a definition of the value chain, which is also known from the reporting directive, but it has been changed during the negotiations to a chain of activities definition, which probably makes more sense in terms of understanding exactly what it is that you will be looking at and addressing in your due diligence process. It covers the upstream activities of the company's business partners and also the downstream. But during negotiations, from our understanding is that, for example, they exclude the disposal of the products. So there are certain areas in downstream that are not covered in the final compromise. The climate transition plan is still in the text, with also a requirement to implement a transition plan, but it's no longer connected to the incentives, the financial incentives to the management or to directors. Then we have the civil liability regime in the text. This has been also changed a little bit, and it is our understanding that the companies will now be held liable if they are the ones that cause the damage, while they will not be held not for the damage caused by their business relationships. Financial companies, that has been a big point of debate in the negotiations. Should they be in or should they be out? They are still in, but they are only covered in their upstream activities, and that means the loans and investments are excluded. Penalties. The companies can receive penalties of a maximum up to 5% of the company's net worldwide turnover, and this doesn't seem to be any change in that. Finally, a very, very big discussion around these rules, and probably why it's taken so long, is the director's duty of care. It was proposed in the original text that the management should they should be responsible for the implementation and setting up and overseeing the company's due diligence processes, and those obligation has been deleted in the final text. And with that, I think it's time to hear a little bit from the real world.
Indeed, it is. And I think just as a bridge between what Mette was explaining and what Dorte will take us through in terms of concrete examples, I'm just reminded of the time back in the early spring of 2011 when I was part of a group that was introduced to the draft guiding principles. And Professor Rogge, who was a mild and persistent man, was carefully charting out the implications of this set of guiding principles, including the fact that you are responsible for your entire, for all of your business relationships. And one of the leaders of a really large American-based global company was saying, "Are you crazy? Do you really understand what you're asking us to do?" And Professor Rogge just smiled and said, "Yes, that is exactly what I'm asking you to do." So Dorte, on that note, what we would like to understand from you is you are a large, or you work in a large company with many business relationships. How did you go about, getting started with this? And can you share some really practical examples of how you're approaching it?
I can do my best, certainly. Yes. As you mentioned, Lundbeck is a company with more than 5,000 employees and has a long history of managing both environmental and social impacts and risk to the company, also long before I joined the company. I think here we are looking very much at how this new due diligence directive, and particularly right now we're in the process of getting ready for the first year reporting for the CSRD reporting standard. And in that work, certainly the due diligence way of the sustainability due diligence way of thinking, particularly also when looking at understanding our potential impacts in our value chain, is where it's very present at the moment, where we are on a daily basis discussing severity and how to understand more, and where do we need to understand better how we are connected through the way that we do our business in the value chain. There's many practical examples, but right now it's very clear that we have now a process in place that runs annually for the purpose of determining what material information should go in our external sustainability statements, and also to make sure that we are continuously aware of monitoring with our development in our value chain, with development of our business. Are we aware of the potential negative impacts and the risk to the business? So we've kind of, with that process, which is one that it's very kind of you to say that I own sustainability due diligence in Lundbeck. I think I very much co-own the identification of the risks and impacts together with very good colleagues in corporate finance, in group finance. I think I own the embedding of this in the company, and the kind of the stage also of reporting is where the corporate sustainability and the group finance function very much are in place.
Yeah, so that's where it all comes together, and it's really important, like you say, to emphasize that you don't own the risks, but you own leading the process to ensure that you address those risks. So Lundbeck is, as you said, operating in an already highly regulated business environment, certainly with a key focus on patients' health, and patients' rights. So what is new? What has been added to what we would presume would already be robust processes?
That's a very good question. I think we are finding out what we need to add. I think it's fair to say. Like you mentioned, we do have a number of processes. I think many companies can recognize, the way of thinking of understanding a problem and addressing it, and kind of the wheel that you run. The very used example is often the health and safety. This is exactly the way of working, where you continuously work, even not on a yearly basis, but continuously work to understand how you're making your employees safe, and you take action, and you monitor, and you follow up, and you make sure that wheel kind of runs all the time, because you want to make the difference of keeping your employees safe. And we have similar in Lundbeck. In our value chain, some of our most important sustainability matters, where we have the biggest impact, it's actually related to the downstream, because we produce medicine, and it has a very big potential negative impact, for instance, for patients if our products are not safe. Mm-hmm. So we have very robust and very regulated processes for product and patient safety that actually you can recognize that wheel. But there isn't, and we have more examples of practical implications also with regards to our suppliers, where the processes we have today very much focus on the big risk related to, we have service providers, not raw material, but service providers who act on our behalf towards healthcare systems and sometimes public officials. So in the medical industry, we have very robust setups for due diligence with regards to those type of suppliers, service providers, to ensure anti-corruption, ethical marketing, and some of these things. But I think what we are looking at right now is how these siloed effects fit together. Because in the CSRD, you're supposed to describe it, and you see this wheel that we present here of the process, and you would perhaps, when you read it, think that, read the guidance on how to report on this, that it's one big wheel. And in fact, it's a lot of small wheels that's running in the company, and we have to somehow bring it better together, I think, in the communication and also in our management, to really see, is there any of these potential negative impacts with our suppliers, perhaps in the human rights and labor rights space with global suppliers. Are there some hotspots? Are there some categories that we need to manage a bit more robustly. But also, tying it all together to make sure that we do. That we and the outside can tell this is how we manage in the different processes, the different impacts and risks to the company.
So what you're saying is you built it on already existing processes. Very good example with health and safety. Every company, regardless, would need to monitor health and safety and to drive efforts in that regard. So even if you do not necessarily have the same regulation as we do as you do in the space of patient regulation, then on the employee side, you also mentioned the suppliers, and I think what is interesting here is if you then think about the combination in this due diligence directive of environment and human rights. This is an area that is often being discussed. What is the link? Have you identified any links between respect of human rights and environmental impacts?
Yes, I think, for instance, for our company, we buy one of our supply categories is chemicals, because we use different kind of chemicals to produce our medicine, basically. And so a supplier or someone who's producing chemicals, in that place, there will both be some environmental risks or some potential negative impacts that we want to have a sense of how are they managing this? Can we be happy to have a business relationship with them? Are they managing this in a good manner? That they are aware of the potential, because chemicals can be, a lot of these things have also a lot of attention in the regulation upcoming, which is very fair. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, when you are producing chemicals, there is a clear kind of risk to the health of the employees. And this can be working conditions that can be potentially very dangerous if they are not protecting this. Mm-hmm. And also, when you do look into the global supply chains of this, you might buy your chemicals from a wholesaler or distributor in Europe, but you do know that they are produced globally around the world. So I think this is where today, when we kind of manage these business relationships and go and visit and so forth, we're not asking them, are you respecting the human rights of your employees? But what we are looking for are some of these things that might not have the very clear human rights tag or labor rights tag on it, but that is in fact what we are looking for.
Which is a really, really good piece of advice. And it addresses what we will be talking about shortly, namely how it also translates into your reporting on workers in the value chain. So I think I will just ask you, because I see that we have several questions coming in through the chat. So I'll just ask you one more question from my side is, have you identified also a value to the business in establishing more robust processes on human rights due diligence?
Absolutely. I think really looking to this source code when we're implementing the CSRD mandated way of reporting, also with the EU taxonomy, where there is a specific activity for the pharmaceutical industry where we have to report on whether we make a substantial contribution to pollution prevention. When we looked at this, understanding the underlying code of what is that they are asking, do you have the processes in place, has been very helpful in trying to kind of translate these disclosure requirements. But on a very practical level, the due diligence process is the way you should work if you want to change something. If you want to keep your employees safe, you have to continuously understand what is it that's making them have accidents and sick. So yes, there's many ways of applying, particularly the operational level, due diligence way of working. Really understand what the problem is, set up the actions, try and stop it, try to make it better, monitor if you're doing it well, be transparent about it so that everybody else can follow, look you in the cards, and maybe you discover people you want to work with. And it gives you a good, if you look for these things with your key business partners, you will find that these companies who take care about these things, they are good business partners because they run good businesses, generally speaking. Mm-hmm. So there's no correlation
benefit
necessarily, but there is no causality, but there's a correlation. So I think those are some of the examples of how I think most companies would say that it brings value.
Great. Thank you for that. And we have a number of questions that also relate to, so what is now coming in the regulation? Obviously, we're all excited about that. So before going to Mette, then a question for you, Dorte, is we heard from Mette that the director's duty has been taken out of the directive now. What I'm sure that the audience here would be curious about is, in your company then, who is then ultimately responsible for your due diligence?
I mean, that's a good question, but as we already talked about, a lot of these potential negative impacts, they are managed today. And so they're built into different functions, and we have the hierarchy that you have in an organization, in a company, that assigns the accountability with the top management. I mean, so
ultimately it goes to the top management.
I mean, mm-hmm. For me, I have to make the very strong disclaimer of not having the legal glasses on this, mm-hmm. but from a sustainability governance perspective, today it's very clear that the accountability for how we run our business, and this includes if we are relying on, if we have an actual negative impact, or if we are disregarding a large risk to the company of sustainability towards what the shareholders would not like, or if we are fundamentally being not transparent on a potential big negative impact of in our supply chain or somewhere else. I don't see that does not already live with our executive management and our board of directors.
So that's a really, really clear and very strong message to convey to those of you out there, that you will want to anchor this with your top management and also involve the board in what this entails. And I'm sure there would be a lot of discussions with the board on and executive management on all of that. So Mette, can you give us a few examples about what is now coming? Because that is what everybody is keen to know. So what would be, let me just read here. So who would be the most accountable executive? Somebody is asking. How will companies with less than 1,000 employees be affected? And there are more about, what are the boundaries around this? Mm. So will you take this away?
I will try. Mm-hmm. At least when it comes to how will this affect those companies that are not in scope of the due diligence directive, it will obviously have an effect that it will trickle down the value chain, because these big companies that will have to implement due diligence processes, they'll be very interested to know how their business relationships, they address their negative impacts, because they have to take that information into their due diligence process and know how to address it. So they will ask questions, they will at least signal to their business relationship that this is something they pay attention to. So no matter whether you're in scope or not, you will likely experience that they'll be much more interested in how you address negative impacts on people and the planet, and not just how you identify them, but also address them and how you make it try to make it right. So it's highly recommended for all to familiarize yourself with the due diligence concepts, and we also recommend to start working from this approach, because it will help you. And with these companies, of course, there is a difference in scope between the CSRD, the reporting directive, and the due diligence directive. So you might be in scope for the reporting directive, and here you, of course, have to also be transparent about your due diligence processes.
And that's a really good cue, because we've had the contours of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Let's make sure that we get all of the acronyms right. We've had that for a while, and now we will have clarity on the due diligence directive. And some would argue that maybe they should have come in a different order, but now that's the way it is. So can you explain what is the difference?
Yeah, the main difference is, of course, that while the corporate reporting directive, corporate sustainability reporting directive, CSRD, it mandates transparency about what you do. So you will have to disclose what are your procedures that relates to due diligence processes. So it doesn't mandate behavior. It doesn't tell you that you have to have due diligence process in place, but you have to be transparent about what you have in place. On the other hand, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, that actually mandates companies to implement due diligence processes. And as Dorte very good illustrated, that this is not just one process, but it can be several processes that needs to come together. So here you actually have to set up these processes, embed them in the company, and start identifying and addressing what you identify. Yes, and maybe to go a little bit further, what we will now go through is what are the reporting requirements in CSRD. So what is it that you have to report in your disclosures from CSRD, but also the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, ESRS? What do they tell us about the disclosures on due diligence? First of all of these regulations that you already mentioned, Susanne, they are all relying on the UN Global UN Guiding Principles about Business and Human Rights, and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises on Responsible Business Conduct. So we already have these underlying, very acknowledged international principles as soft law. There's lots of information to be found there, and this is also the foundation for both the CSRD and CSDDD. Then in the CSRD and the ESRS standards, you will find the principles around due diligence. They're described in what we call the ESRS 1 standard. This is where it explains that the due diligence process, it is a process. So it is several steps that you have to go through, and I mentioned this in the beginning. If you want to have even more information about these 6 steps, we can recommend to maybe watch our webinar from 1 year ago, where we deep dived a little bit more into the 6 steps. But it is a process that you have to implement, and it is actually the entire structure in the ESRS is very much founded on those 6 steps. It's also an ongoing practice. It is written in the ESRS 1. And that, of course, means it's not something you do just once. It is something that is going on all the time. So when Dorte explained that Lundbeck is having health and safety processes, and there'll be processes around the supply of chemicals, etc. It is like several processes ongoing, and they're going on all the time. And you may need to show that you can manage to put all these processes together on an ongoing basis, so you can actually address new impacts that might arise. It can be from buying a new company, entering into a new market, or buying from a new supplier in another geography that you don't know much about, but it might be a high-risk area. So those new changes in your business, you need to have a look at also from the due diligence perspective. What do you need to be aware of and what do you need to address? And of course, this leads to, you will get a lot of information from your due diligence process. You will actually identify your negative impacts directly in the due diligence process. So that gives you more or less all the information you need for your double materiality assessment from the impact perspective. And then ESS1 also gives you a little bit of a, like, they sort of map from the different steps in the due diligence process. Here I've taken the example of embedding due diligence in the governance, strategy, and business model. And then they show you which disclosure requirements in the ESRS standards that will then relate to that step of the due diligence process. So when you read through the ESRS1, you will actually see, okay, these are the disclosures that are related to the due diligence process from the ESRS, the EFRAG and the standard setters from their perspective. Good. So that's the principles. And then there's the actual disclosures on due diligence. And that asks the company for a statement on due diligence. This is then further described as that the undertaking needs to, or the company needs to disclose a mapping of the information provided in its sustainability statement about the sustainability due diligence processes. And the objective of that disclosure is to facilitate an understanding of the undertaking's due diligence processes with regard to sustainability matters. And then if you look further in this standard, you can find in the application requirements and a table where we have copied in here in this slide, and it is suggested that you may disclose your information by using this table. And it looks very simple, but maybe this, we're working with several processes, and it's a lot of information coming together. It will be interesting to see how this is applied in reality. And maybe it would be very interesting to hear from you, Dorte, how Lundbeck has actually taken in this advice. Are you working with this table, and how do you actually manage to talk about the due diligence processes, and does it become coherent when you work with a table like this?
I think we are still definitely, as I mentioned, finding out how to present this, because as already mentioned, and a table like this would then, and we're using not this exact table, but something very close to this, in actually doing the internal mapping of all of the relevant siloed processes that we have that relate to the material impacts and risks that we want to report on going forward, and also want to manage. Because as you're saying, the due diligence processes are not mandated, but since the transparency requirements are here now, you do become very aware of how are we actually managing this in order to be able to explain. Even if you are in the places where you feel like this is where, we have a long history here, we're doing it well, this is very mature, this process. In other areas where you are maybe not so mature, in all the cases, in order for you to communicate something, you need to establish the facts. And it's no small task in an organization, even in companies smaller than Lundbeck. People work in your functions. You do your job. You do what you are responsible for, and it hasn't perhaps been so apparent how these things all fit together. And I think particularly what we also discuss among peers is that some of these things that are mandated by law that you're supposed to do, for instance, if you are a food producing company, you maybe you don't today report a lot on how you're making sure that the food you're selling is safe. You just kind of, but we have to do that, otherwise we couldn't do our business. And we also have a lot of these things where we are saying, well, when you think of the requirements, why they have been put in place, think about that it should be apparent to all readers of the report, affected stakeholders, how you are managing these things. Even from an inside perspective, it's easy to understand how things fit together. So yes, we are mapping this out, and I can't tell you yet how we will put this in the report, but certainly one thing we can say already is that there is going to be some of these areas, particularly in tracking effectiveness, where we will for some years disclose that we don't necessarily have very good metrics on the impact side. Generally speaking, the way we manage our company today, where we are very focused on the risk to the company, the metrics and the targets we set and how we monitor the effectiveness of what we do is focused on inside the company. But the logic here is that if you're trying to make the situation better for someone in your value chain, for workers in the value chain, or for biodiversity, you need to really understand the connections and then monitor that situation, the impact that you're trying to improve. If that's what you're saying, also in your policies and in what you're actually leading towards. It's not the number of workshops you've held with your suppliers. It's the working conditions for the affected community. The affected stakeholders here is the people working there. So,
yeah. Can I then chip in here, because we have a couple of questions from the chat, and certainly the takeaway message is that you can start already with this, as you also described, Dorte, because this is not reliant in itself or per se on data that would be ready by the end of the year. So describing the process is something that you can start now and already should have done perhaps yesterday. We have two questions for you, Dorte. So one is about what can you elaborate on what you mean with the siloed processes?
Yes, siloed is perhaps comes across as a negative word, but as mentioned, an example is that we have health and safety experts. They are working in that silo in the way that it doesn't mean that they're not working very closely with our people and organization colleagues who work with well-being and neurodiversity, and so of course it's not like we don't speak and collaborate, but you also know that if you have product quality people, they have to do their work and they have to run their processes. So that's probably what I mean with, and then you have the ones dealing with the responsible supply chain management, and so we do have these, different roles and responsibilities in an organization. So that's what I mean.
So maybe about the main processes runs in the silos, but of course there was something coming together at the top and across the organization. But for the main part of the work, it has to run in silos where the experts and the people responsible, they actually work.
Yes, and I think the OECD terminology is like operational level due diligence. You have that, and in different parts of the organization, and then tying it together, and maybe also this mapping exercise will help us hopefully also identify how we can. Perhaps develop some of these processes to be more efficiently run. That is certainly my expectation. We all do that in all the companies all the time. Once in a while, we review how we do things and look at roles and responsibilities. which is a big part of this work, actually.
So another question from the viewers is one that you've also touched upon earlier, goes back to the guiding principles that talk about a risk-based approach and appropriate measures in that regard. So how do you go beyond tier 1?
Yeah, with great difficulty is
and some caution, I'm sure. Yes,
but I think some of the recommendations also, I think, directly from some of the people who've been involved in the work, both with the due diligence work and the EFRAG standards and so forth, talk about this like hotspot approach. I mean, you can look at your data of where your suppliers are, and that will tell you, like Mette mentioned, if you have a lot of suppliers that supply something which is very central to your company, and they are in a high-risk country, or where they are, but in modern supply chains, definitely also looking at the categories. And today, it was more difficult a decade ago. Today, when you then look at what your different categories are, there is a lot of research on what are the risks in the metal value chain, in the food value chain, and even dial down a bit more. And if you feel that it's hard to get started and you don't know where these sources are of this research and these risk maps, and then call in some experts who understand human and environmental problems in global supply chains. And they can, look at your value chain. This is what they're asking you to do yourself. With a little bit of guidance, you will soon get to where are the hotspots, the ones that you definitely connected to your industry and your specific value chain, of the things that you use and have as key parts of your business. Yes, I think then you can also look at your tier 1 data, but that's just one data point. Try and use your best judgment and saying, can I say something here? And you don't have to think that hard about it. Ask your friends, your teenage kids, someone in your who can say, what's the big problem with the pharmaceutical industry? They will tell you what your problems are in your value chain. What is the ones, the biggest ones, or if you're in another industry.
That's a really, really good tip, is that there would be many stakeholders who claim to know your business even better than you do yourself, because they would have a view. So we realize that time is running, and as always, when you are in good company, so it's time for us to close. There are a few questions we didn't get to answer, so we will send you our responses. What we want to share here is that you can register for upcoming webinars from us. And you can also go to that page on our homepage, where you will find some of the previous webcasts that have covered these topics around sustainability management. So the next one is in May, where we will be talking about how to kickstart your sustainable business transformation, really very much building on what we have discussing here. What we've been discussing here is the insights that you gain from the due diligence and how you leverage some of those to make your business more sustainable. So with that, a huge thank you to you, Dorte, for sharing your practical examples and approach as a company that is in scope. And for you, Mette, for explaining what is now coming for all of the companies in scope, and also a bit of guidance to those not yet in scope to be ready, because it will be coming your way as well. So thank you all, and have a wonderful day.